Hello and welcome to Stories of Evening Whispers of Love. We are glad you are here. Settle in, relax, and get ready to hear of Elizabeth's love triangle as she moves from Pennsylvania to start a new life. It begins as a business arrangement. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The stagecoach rattled over the Rocky Montana Trail, jostling Elizabeth Laurel in her seat. Dust clung to her skirts, and the wide-brimmed hat perched precariously on her head. She stared out at the rolling hills and distant mountains, trying to steady the tremor in her hands. Pennsylvania had been home once, but those days were gone. The house she had shared with her late husband felt like a mausoleum of memories, each corner a cruel reminder of what she had lost. She pressed a gloved hand to her chest. This trip, this strange, daring venture to a man she had never met, was her last attempt at life beyond grief. Montana was vast, wild, and frightening, but it promised something she hadn't felt in months. Possibility. Edward York's ranch came into view, a sturdy log cabin nestled at the edge of a sprawling pasture dotted with sheep. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the early evening sky. Elizabeth's heart gave a tentative flutter. This is it. This is where I'll try again. The stagecoach driver tipped his hat. Here you are, ma'am. That'll be the York place. Elizabeth climbed down, her legs stiff from the long journey. She took in a ranch, a barn leaning slightly to the east, a small corral with a few restless sheep, and the unmistakable figure of a man standing near the gate, arms crossed. He was broad-shouldered, with rough hands and a stern face shadowed by a wide hat. The wind tugged at his coat, revealing the faint sheen of dust and sweat from a long day's work. "Miss?" he called, his voice gruff, the tone uninviting. "Elizabeth Laurel," she said, lifting her chin. She tried to summon a smile. "I answered your advertisement." Edward's eyes swept her over, and Elizabeth felt a shiver of unease. He didn't look pleased. In fact, his expression bordered on disappointment. "Well," he said finally, scratching at his jaw, "you're taller than I expected." Elizabeth blinked. "Taller than expected? I'm sure that won't be a problem," she said cautiously. She adjusted her hat and lifted her shoulders, refusing to shrink. Edward grunted. "We'll see. I'll show you the cabin. You can settle in. Dinner'll be ready soon." The cabin was small but functional. The air scented with smoke and something faintly medicinal. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. Elizabeth set down her trunk, careful not to scuff the floor. "You'll be helping with the sheep?" Edward said abruptly, as if speaking any other pleasantries would be wasted. "And the barn, and the house, I suppose. If you think you can manage all that. Remember, this is just business." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. She had expected hard work. She had not expected rudeness. Still, she lifted her chin higher. "I can manage. I've managed before." Edward's lips twitched, perhaps a hint of amusement, or perhaps irritation. "We'll see. Supper in an hour." He pointed to a room at the end of the cabin with a brass bed and simple nightstand. With that, he strode back toward the barn, boots thudding against the earth. Elizabeth stood in the quiet cabin, listening to the wind whip around the corners. Montana was nothing like Pennsylvania, and Edward York was nothing like the gentle widower she had imagined in her mind. Yet there was something about the way he moved, purposeful and strong, that made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. As she unpacked a few belongings, she reminded herself of her purpose: survival, a fresh start, and perhaps, if fortune favored her, a life worth living again. Tomorrow she would meet the sheep. Tomorrow she would meet Edward York properly. And tomorrow she would begin the hardest challenge of her life: making a home in a place that felt more wild and welcoming, and possibly taming a man as stubborn as the Montana mountains themselves. Elizabeth stood in the quiet cabin, listening to the wind whip around the corners. Montana was nothing like Pennsylvania, and Edward York was nothing like the gentle widower she had imagined in her mind. Yet there was something about the way he moved, purposeful and strong, that made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. She set her small trunk beside the bed, fingers trembling, and for the first time since she left home, she let herself sink onto the edge of the mattress. The exhaustion and tension of the long journey, the uncertainty of this strange new place, and the weight of her grief pressed down on her chest. A shuddering sigh escaped her, then another, until silent tears began to slide down her cheeks. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to choke back the sobs, but it was no use. Months of sadness and fear she hadn't allowed herself to feel fully came spilling out in the dim glow of the cabin fire. A sudden creak at the doorway startled her. Edward stood there, arms crossed, one booted foot tapping on the floor. He gave her a flat look, the shadow of his hat cutting across his face. She sniffled and wiped at her eyes. I'm fine, she said quickly, ashamed of her weakness. Edward's lips pressed into a thin line, and he rolled his eyes. Well, you're making quite the performance of it, he muttered, his voice gruff but with just the faintest edge of something else, though Elizabeth couldn't place it. It's been a long day, she admitted softly. Her words faltered, and she buried her face in her hands again. He grunted, shifting his weight. Humph. Just try not to flood the cabin. Walls ain't made for puddles. Elizabeth gave a shaky laugh through her tears. I'll try. Edward tipped his hat back, muttered something under his breath, and left the cabin, the door shutting with a definitive thunk. She listened to his boots fade into night and felt an odd mixture of embarrassment and relief. She was alone again, but for the first time, she allowed herself to truly cry. And somewhere in the distance, a stubborn man in Montana rolled his eyes, completely unaware that she wasn't crying because of him, or maybe, just maybe, a little because of him. Chapter 2. The Sheep and Storm. The next morning, Elizabeth awoke to the sharp scent of smoke and hay, the first streaks of dawn spilling over the mountains. She dressed quickly in her thick skirts and boots, determined not to waste another minute. Breakfast is on the table, Edward called gruffly from the other room. After that, you're on the sheep. Elizabeth stiffened at his tone. On the sheep? She had expected hard work, but something about the way he said it made it sound like punishment. She set her jaw and followed him outside. The crisp morning air stung her cheeks. A flock of sheep clustered near the corral, their wool matted and dust-covered, bleating impatiently. Edward strode ahead of her, hands on his hips, clearly expecting her to fall behind. All right, he barked. You don't just stand there staring at them. Move em to the north pasture. Elizabeth lifted her chin. And how do you expect me to do that? She asked. Edward arched a brow. Like this, he said, swinging his arm toward the flock. Shout. Wave your arms. Don't let them get ahead of you. And whatever you do, don't get in their way. They'll knock you down faster than a freight wagon. Elizabeth swallowed her pride and stepped forward, waving her arms awkwardly. The sheep looked at her as if she were a new sort of predator and scattered in every direction except where she wanted. One stubborn ram charged at her, and she jumped back with a startled yelp. Edward's exasperated groan carried across the field. You're going to get yourself killed if you're that timid. I'm not timid. Elizabeth shot back, her cheeks flushing. I've just never dealt with animals that think they own the world. Edward interrupted, his voice sharp. Well, welcome to Montana. You'll learn fast, or you'll be dinner for something worse than a ram. Elizabeth's hands clenched into fists. Arrogant, rude man. But she squared her shoulders and moved forward again, her boots sinking into the soft earth. She began to whistle and wave her arms, trying to herd the flock. Sheep darted every which way, but slowly, clumsily, she started to get a rhythm. From across the pasture, a shout carried over the breeze. Good morning. Elizabeth turned to see a tall, lean man riding a horse toward the corral. His jacket was neat, his hat tilted just so, and his eyes, bright, curious, and clearly assessing her, made her heart skip. This is Elizabeth, isn't it? He called. Edward's jaw tightened, though he didn't answer. Yes, Elizabeth said cautiously, shading her eyes. And you are... Charles Barton, he said with a charming tilt of his head. I live just over the hill. I couldn't help but notice, well, he smiled, and it was easy warm. You handle those sheep like you've done it all your life. Impressive. Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. Thank you, she said softly, brushing at a smear of dirt. Charles's gaze lingered, and she realized with a small thrill that he was genuinely admiring her. Not just her skill, but her. She tried to hide her flustered smile behind her hands, but he seemed to notice anyway. Edward grunted beside her. "Glad you're impressed," he muttered, rolling his eyes in his usual fashion. Charles laughed lightly. "I'm not the only one watching, am I?" he asked, glancing at Edward with a hint of mischief. Edward's eyes narrowed, and he muttered something under his breath before turning his attention back to the flock. Elizabeth returned her attention to the sheep, but she couldn't stop the small flutter in her chest. Charles Barton was charming, easy to talk to, and clearly smitten with her. She hadn't even spoken more than a few sentences with him, and already she felt a curious warmth that Edward's gruff presence hadn't stirred. Yet, by midday, Elizabeth was covered in dirt and sweat, her hands raw, and her skirts torn in a dozen places. She had managed to move half the flock to the north pasture, and though it had been chaotic, she felt a surge of pride. Edward finally approached, dusting off his sleeves. "You didn't kill yourself. That's something." He paused, squinting at her. "You're stronger than I thought." Elizabeth blinked, surprised by the faint praise hidden in his gruff words. "Thank you, I suppose," she said cautiously. He grunted and turned away. "Don't get used to it. There's still plenty more to do." As he walked back toward the barn, Elizabeth couldn't help but glance toward Charles, who waved before riding off down the trail. For the first time in months, she felt something flutter in her chest that wasn't grief or fear. And though Edward York rolled his eyes as usual, neither of them could yet know that the battle for her heart had already begun. Chapter 3, Breaking Point. The sun had barely crested the Montana mountains when Elizabeth and Edward were already at each other's throats. A stubborn ram had bolted back toward the barn, and Edward barked orders that clashed with Elizabeth's equally determined instructions. "You're doing it all wrong," he shouted, waving his arms. "You'll scatter the whole flock if you keep moving like that." "I'm not doing it wrong." Elizabeth snapped back, frustration boiling over. "I've got half the sheep in the right pasture already. Maybe if you weren't so bossy." "Bossy?" Edward cut her off sharply. "I'm trying to save you from getting trampled. Unlike you, I've been handling animals that actually matter for years." Elizabeth's face flushed red. "Well, maybe if you weren't so hard all the time, I wouldn't feel like I'm failing." Edward froze, his jaw tight. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the bleating of the sheep. Then he exhaled sharply. "My wife, she died of scarlet fever," he said quietly, almost to himself. Elizabeth blinked, shocked. She hadn't known. Until now, she had assumed the house was empty simply because he'd never remarried. Not because he had lost someone. Her voice softened. I'm sorry, Edward." He waved her words away, returning to his usual gruffness. I don't talk about it much." Elizabeth stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I didn't mean to." "No, it's fine. Just, I have to go to the lower pasture. You should get back to work." And with that, Edward left. Elizabeth couldn't see how any of this was going to work. By mid-afternoon, she was quietly packing her trunk, each folded skirt and folded shirt a bitter reminder that she might be leaving Montana, and Edward forever. She barely noticed the sound of hooves on the dirt path until a shadow fell across the yard. Charles Barton appeared, carrying a bundle of rope. "Thought I'd come see if you needed some extra hand with the sheep," he said casually, trying to look nonchalant. Elizabeth glanced up. I think I'm managing, thank you." Charles shrugged, setting the rope down. Couldn't hurt to lend a hand. Just keep things moving. He lingered longer than necessary, subtly offering help, smoothing his voice when he spoke to her, and keeping an eye on her movements. Edward, watching from the barn, narrowed his eyes. He was seeing the way Charles looked at Elizabeth, the faint warmth in his voice, and he felt a sharp twinge of irritation, or maybe something more complicated. "Here, Beth, can you grab that side?" Charles said casually, pointing to a gate latch. Elizabeth froze. "Beth," she repeated. Charles's eyes widened. Sorry. Habit, I suppose." Edward's jaw tightened. Beth, he thought, recognizing the ease with which Charles used a nickname, the familiarity that shouldn't be there. He smirked in that quiet, hard way. "So he has a thing for her, does he?" Elizabeth busied herself with the latch. cheeks flushing, oblivious to Edward's private realization. Charles lingered, helping where he could without making it obvious, always careful to hide the softness in his eyes. Edward found himself watching Elizabeth as well, despite his best efforts to remain indifferent. He hated himself a little for the way he had shouted at her earlier about his wife, for the harsh words he had spat without thinking. And yet she looked so much like her, like his late wife, in the tilt of her head, the shape of her hands. He shoved the thought down, unwilling to speak it aloud. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was overwhelmed. Between the fight, the sheep, and the quiet tension Edward radiated, she felt like she could hardly breathe. She returned to her packing, stuffing clothes into her trunk with trembling hands, trying to prepare for a departure she never wanted but now felt forced to take. Charles finally mounted his horse to leave, his eyes lingering on her as he tipped his hat. "If you need anything, don't hesitate," he said softly, before heading down the trail. Edward, watching him leave, felt a pang of possessiveness he refused to name. He thinks she's his already, he realized, even though he had no claim, and he hated how much it bothered him. Elizabeth closed her trunk with a heavy sigh, unaware that the subtle battle for her heart had begun, and that Edward York, stubborn and rough as the Montana mountains, was already watching her more closely than he intended. Chapter 4. The Lake in the Fall. The lake lay like glass in the morning light, the mountains reflecting perfectly in its still waters. Elizabeth waded in up to her waist, shivering at the chill, then slipped in fully, letting the cool water wash away the dust and dirt of the past few days. She closed her eyes, enjoying the rare, quiet moment of peace. Edward York had crept down the bank, hidden behind the trees, drawn by something he refused to name. He didn't intend to look, and yet he couldn't turn away. She moved with natural grace, the water tracing the curve of her shoulders, highlighting the strength and elegance in her frame. Sunlight glinted off her wet hair as she tilted her head, unaware of him entirely. His chest tightened, a bitter pang of longing stirring where he had tried to suppress it. Gods above, she's beautiful, he thought, forcing himself to stay silent. He averted his eyes for a moment, then glanced again, unable to tear his gaze away. A sudden voice cut through the quiet. "Edward York." Edward spun around to see Charles Barton riding up, eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What are you doing?" Charles demanded. Edward straightened, anger flaring. "It's none of your concern." "None of my concern?" "You're sneaking around, watching her, and calling it none of your concern." Charles snapped. "You've treated her like dirt since she arrived, yelling at her, scolding her, and now this?" "Really?" Edward's jaw clenched. "Listen, Barton, she's here because of me. I paid her fare. Not you. You have no claim here." Charles's face darkened, his voice rising. "You don't even like her. You're cruel to her half the time, and you act like she's just a servant." He stopped, taking a breath. "I am in love with her." Edward's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer, fury and protectiveness sparking in his chest. "Love her? You barely know her. Stay out of this." Charles squared his shoulders. "I know more than you think, and you don't even see her properly, because you're too blind with your own pride." The two men's voices echoed across the trees, tension crackling like the distant thunder. Then Elizabeth emerged from the lake, towel wrapped around her shoulders, hair dripping and glistening in the morning sun. Both men froze, Edward still furious and Charles fuming, realizing immediately that they had been caught in the middle of a delicate moment. They stepped back in the shadows, giving her space as she dried herself, oblivious of the storm of words exchanged just meters away. By the time she had dressed and returned toward the cabin, dark clouds were rolling across the sky. Thunder rumbled faintly, and the first drops of rain spattered against the earth. The sheep were restless in the pasture. Edward, already soaked and shouting at the herd, gestured wildly. "Move, you idiots! Into the barn! Come on!" Elizabeth ran to help, gripping a struggling sheep as Edward tried to herd the others. A sudden slip on the muddy slope sent Edward crashing to the ground with a sickening crack. His arm bent unnaturally beneath him. "Edward!" Elizabeth cried, running toward him. He groaned in pain, clutching the broken arm. Elizabeth tore strips from her damp skirt and carefully fashioned a splint, pressing his arm into position. "Hold still, Edward. It's going to be all right," she said, her voice firm but trembling. "I'm fine. Just get someone," he muttered through clenched teeth. Elizabeth ran to the road, summoning Charles. He arrived almost instantly, helping guide Edward back to the cabin. Within minutes, the local doctor arrived. "You did a good job, Miss Laurel," the doctor said, examining Edward's arm. "Splinting was perfect. He'll be down for 6 weeks at least, maybe more, but you kept him from further injury." Elizabeth exhaled, rain plastering her hair to her forehead. For the first time, she realized she couldn't leave. She couldn't abandon him now, not when he depended on her so fully. Edward, seated awkwardly, glanced at her, a mixture of guilt and something deeper he refused to name. He had yelled at her before, but now he saw her strength, her courage, her determination, and it stirred something dangerous in him. Charles lingered nearby, pretending casual concern while secretly watching Elizabeth. His feelings for her had long been hidden, but now, seeing her care for Edward, he felt a mixture of jealousy and admiration. Elizabeth, exhausted and wet from the rain, noticed nothing. Montana's rain fell steadily, washing the dust on the land, leaving 3 lives irrevocably changed. Chapter 5. Confessions at the Creek. The rain had eased into a gentle drizzle by mid-morning. Elizabeth, her long, dark hair still damp from the morning chores, decided to fetch water from the creek a little way from the cabin. The sun was hidden behind heavy clouds, and the mountains loomed gray and quiet in the distance. When she arrived, she was surprised to see Charles already at the creek. He was tall and willowy, his movements graceful, almost too precise for the rugged landscape, and he carried a bucket of water. He looked up as she approached, his eyes softening. "I wasn't expecting anyone," Elizabeth said cautiously. Charles gave a faint smile. "Nor was I, really. I just thought I'd come check on the sheep and fetch some water while I was at it." His voice was casual, but his gaze lingered on her longer than necessary. Elizabeth set her bucket down, the chill of the creek water brushing her wrists. "It's all right," she said. For a long moment, they worked in silence, the sound of the creek bubbling over rocks, the only noise between them. Charles kept glancing at her, studying the curve of her shoulders, the sweep of her wet hair, the way her eyes caught the light. His hands were steady, but his chest tightened with each passing second. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and almost hesitant. "I suppose I ought to tell you. I was engaged once. Thought I'd have a family by now, married young. But on the day of the wedding, she never showed up. Left me for another man. I've been single ever since." Elizabeth's eyes softened. She stepped closer and lightly placed her hand on his arm. I'm sorry. That must have been awful." Charles turned to her, his expression earnest. I've never told anyone that story before, but you feel like someone I can trust." For a moment, he leaned closer, and before Elizabeth could think, he kissed her. Her heart leapt, a mixture of surprise, confusion, and warmth. She didn't pull away immediately. The honesty in his eyes and the gentleness of his touch held her. But reality struck, and she finally broke free, stepping back. I should go," she stammered, collecting her bucket. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, but Edward was waiting at the cabin. She had to return. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Edward's patience had worn thin. The moment Elizabeth had left, he sought out Charles, finding him near the barn. "Barton," Edward said, voice tight, "you're getting in the way. She's here for me, not you. You need to get the hell out of it before you cause trouble." Charles squared his shoulders, his calm expression betraying a glint of defiance. "I'm not going anywhere. I didn't bring her here. You did. But I'll be honest. Edward, I like her. I'm going to win her heart if I can." Edward's jaw clenched. "You're blind if you think she'd ever—" He stopped, glare sharpening. "You better hope she never sees you as anything more than a neighbor." Charles shrugged. "Maybe, but I'll try anyway. She deserves someone who truly cares, and I do." Edward stared at him for a long moment, frustration warring with something he couldn't name, before turning away. The fight wasn't over, but he would keep an eye on Charles, for now. Meanwhile, Elizabeth returned from the creek, dripping wet, dark hair plastered against her shoulders, unaware of the tension between the two men. Edward watched her as she approached, his eyes narrowing at the way Charles had looked at her. "Ready to go into town for supplies?" she asked, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. Edward nodded, voice low. "Be careful. Storm's coming." As she rode toward town, the clouds thickened, lightning flashing over the peaks. Rain began to spatter against the ground, turning the trails to mud. Her heart pounded, not just from the storm but from the swirl of emotions. The kiss, Charles's earnestness, Edward's hard, watchful stare. By the time she returned to the cabin, the storm had grown fierce. She tied her horse and dashed inside, her clothes soaked but her spirit unbroken. Edward sat by the fire, watching her, vulnerability etched across his face. He didn't speak, but the quiet acknowledgment in his gaze told her that something was shifting, a bond forming in the midst of chaos, danger, and complicated hearts. Outside, Charles lingered just past the edge of the cabin yard, pretending casual concern while secretly watching Elizabeth, a determined glint in his eye. He wouldn't give up, not now, not ever. Montana's storm raged across the mountains, lightning flashing and thunder rolling, leaving 3 lives tangled in ways none of them yet fully understood. Chapter 6. Confessions of the Creek. Winter had not yet fully arrived, but the Montana mornings carried a bite that hinted at what was coming. Elizabeth, dark hair tied back in a practical braid, wiped sweat and dust from her brow as she tended the barn. The sheep were restless, and the frost-laced air made every movement slow and deliberate. When she went to the creek to fetch water, she did not expect company. But there he was, Charles Barton, tall and willowy, framed by the shadows of the pines, his long fingers wrapped around the handle of the bucket. He looked almost fragile in the sunlight, yet there was a quiet intensity in his gaze that made Elizabeth pause. "Elizabeth," he said softly, voice low, I need you to listen to me. Not to answer, not to argue, not to speak. Just listen." Elizabeth hesitated, caught off guard by the seriousness in his tone. She set her bucket down. "All right," she said cautiously. Charles took a step closer, boots crunching against frost-hardened earth. "I've tried to hide it, tried to bury it, but I can't anymore. I love you, Elizabeth. I have from the day you arrived. I can't keep pretending that I don't." Elizabeth's eyes widened. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her pulse raced, and she took a small step backward, unsure what to do. "I know you came here because of Edward," Charles continued, voice catching slightly. "And I know you've been doing what you thought was best, but I can't stand aside any longer. I want you to marry me." "Not him. Me." Elizabeth felt the weight of his words. Shock and disbelief left her momentarily speechless. "I'm moving to Wyoming in the spring," Charles said, voice softer, almost pleading. "I want to start over, Elizabeth. I want you there with me. I need you to be there. I'm telling you this so you can think about it. That's all I ask. Think about us." He stepped back, giving her space, his eyes lingering on hers for a long moment before he mounted his horse and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Elizabeth's mind spun. Her heart raced, and she gripped her bucket tightly, trying to steady herself. Shock, confusion, and an unfamiliar flutter of emotion coursed through her. She turned and walked quickly toward the cabin, hoping to regain some sense of composure. She did not notice Edward standing behind the barn, hidden by shadows, watching the entire encounter. Every word, every glance, every pause, he had heard it all. His jaw tightened, and his chest ached with a tangle of jealousy, frustration, and something he wasn't ready to name. He waited quietly until Charles had disappeared down the trail. Only then did Edward step from the shadows, his presence commanding and unspoken. Elizabeth crossed the cabin threshold, dark hair damp from the creek, mind still reeling. She paused, looking at Edward, voice small and uncertain. "Edward, did you hear what Charles said?" Edward's dark eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. "Yes," he said quietly. Her breath caught. That was all he said. Nothing more. But the weight of those 2 words, spoken so simply, hung in the room like a charged wire. Chapter 7. desire, and confession. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire, the chill of the approaching winter pressing against the windows. Elizabeth sat on the edge of the table, dark hair falling over her shoulders, hands trembling slightly, heart racing. Her thoughts were still tangled with Charles's confession and Edward's silent, unreadable presence. She had thought she knew what she felt. Frustration, anger, even resentment toward Edward, but now desire and confusion churned inside her. Edward stood before her, the room narrowing until it felt like there was nothing but the two of them. His dark eyes burned with a mixture of longing and vulnerability, and when his hand found hers, gripping it with fierce intent, a shiver ran down her spine. "Elizabeth," he murmured, voice low and hoarse. "I've held back too long. I tried to push it down, to hide it, to keep my pride intact, but I can't anymore. You've haunted me since the day you arrived, and I love you." Elizabeth's breath caught. The words were raw, fierce, and completely unexpected. She opened her mouth to speak, but Edward silenced her with a finger against her lips. "Don't speak. Just feel," he whispered. And she did. She felt the heat radiating from him. The tension coiled like a spring, the storm a month of anger and friction twisting into something far more urgent. Every scolding, every sharp word, every stubborn clash now seemed to pulse with desire. The hatred she had once felt toward him transformed into a hunger she couldn't resist. Edward's lips descended on hers with urgent hunger, deep and demanding. Elizabeth gasped, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. The kiss grew, insistent and searing, his mouth claiming hers as though he had been waiting a lifetime. "I've wanted you," he growled, voice rough, lips and teeth grazing her skin. "Every day, every hour. I try to hide it, but no more. Elizabeth, I love you. I love you, and I won't hide it anymore." Her pulse hammered in her chest. Every nerve was alive. The warmth of his body, the firmness of his hands along her waist, the slow, deliberate pressure of his lips down her neck, it all made her ache with need. Edward guided her to the floor, the rough wooden boards grounding them, and pressed against her with a hunger she had never imagined. Every kiss, every caress, every brush of his hands was filled with months of suppressed desire. Elizabeth responded instinctively, arching into him, hands clutching his shoulders, body trembling with anticipation and shock at the intensity of their passion. "Elizabeth, you're mine," he whispered against her ear, teeth grazing the sensitive skin, voice thick with lust and devotion. Her knees buckled, heart racing uncontrollably. "Edward, He silenced her with a fierce kiss, his hand roaming her back, tracing every curve, every line. She moaned softly, gasping as his lips trailed along her jaw, neck, and collarbone. Her previous frustrations, her anger, all the sharp edges of her feelings, dissolved into fire desire consuming them both. Their bodies moved together with an urgent rhythm, breath mingling, hearts hammering in sync. Every whisper, every touch, every heated glance spoke of long-denied longing, of passion and love finally unleashed. Elizabeth's hands roamed his back, memorizing the strength beneath his shirt, feeling the warmth of him press against her. "I love you, Elizabeth," Edward groaned, voice low, hoarse. "All of you. Only you." The firelight danced across the cabin walls as they collapsed against the rug, tangled, shivering, hearts pounding, sweat slicked and breathless. Elizabeth rested against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart and the warmth of his body, overwhelmed by the intensity of their first shared passion. She closed her eyes, letting the sensation, the raw desire, the undeniable truth of their feelings wash over her. Confusion lingered at the edges of her mind, about Charles, about the future, but beneath it, certainty burned. Whatever had been between her and Edward before, hatred, frustration, misunderstanding, had been replaced by something far deeper, far more consuming. They lay together in the glow of the fire, hearts racing, bodies entwined, when a faint, almost imperceptible sound from outside made Edward's jaw tighten. Through the cabin window, just beyond the yard, a dark figure stood. Charles. His eyes were narrow, jaw set, fists clenched at his sides, and his lips pressed into a hard line as he listened, rage and jealousy burning in his gaze. Edward didn't speak. He simply held Elizabeth close, protective and possessive, aware that the triangle surrounding them had just shifted, and that the fight for her heart was far from over. Outside, Charles's shoulders tensed as the winter wind whipped around him. At the first time, he realized the depth of Edward's claim and that he would not give up without a battle. Chapter 8. Rain and Confrontation. The next morning, Montana's sky was overcast, gray clouds stretching across the peaks. Elizabeth needed air, a reprieve from the intensity of the night before. Her long, dark hair was loose, falling over her shoulders as she slipped quietly from the cabin and made her way down to the lake. The water shimmered under the dull light, mist curling across its surface. She stepped in, letting the cool liquid wash over her feet, then waded deeper, feeling the current against her skin. For the first time since arriving, she felt weightless, untangled from worry. Her thoughts kept drifting to Edward, his dark eyes, his rough hands, the fierce, passionate way he had claimed her. And yet, Charles's confession lingered at the edges of her mind, stirring curiosity, confusion, and an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. She closed her eyes, letting herself float, the tension of the past weeks slowly melting into the water. A few drops of rain began to fall, lightly at first, then harder, soaking her hair and skin. She laughed softly, spinning in the water as the storm moved in, feeling both alive and utterly bewildered by her own emotions. When she finally climbed the bank, her clothes clinging to her body, soaked through, she was startled to see Charles standing there. His tall, willowy frame seemed even more commanding against the gray sky. "Elizabeth," he murmured, voice low and intense. "I couldn't stay away." Before she could respond, he stepped closer and kissed her, soft at first, then deeper, testing her resistance. Elizabeth's heart raced. She wasn't as caught up in the kiss as she had been with Edward, but she didn't pull away immediately. There was something thrilling, intoxicating about Charles's boldness, and part of her wondered what it would be like to give in. "Charles," she whispered, a mix of hesitation and curiosity in her voice. He leaned closer, hands brushing the wet strands of hair from her face. "I've wanted this, Elizabeth. I can't wait any longer." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks as he began to unfasten her wet blouse, his fingers sliding over the soaked fabric. She froze, embarrassed and conflicted, realizing that her body was reacting even as her mind shouted no. Then a shout broke the spell. "Get away from her." Edward appeared on the trail above the lake, eyes blazing with fury. Without hesitation, he charged at Charles, his fist connecting squarely with Charles's jaw. The impact sent Charles staggering backward, but he recovered quickly, fists raised, anger flaring. The two men clashed, punching and grappling in the rain, mud forming underfoot. Elizabeth stepped back, chest heaving, heart pounding, not just from the fight, but from the confusion and fear coursing through her. She wanted to intervene, to separate them, but her mind was whirling. Edward's possessiveness, Charles's intensity, and the raw emotions that had pulled her between them. Edward's eyes met hers mid-fight, dark and burning. "Stay back," he yelled. "I warned you." Charles sneered, wiping rain from his face. "You think you can claim her, Edward? She's not yours." Elizabeth's throat tightened. She didn't want either of them to be hurt, yet the storm, the rain, and the heat of the fight mirrored the turmoil inside her. Her wet clothes clung to her, her hair plastered to her face, and she felt an almost dizzying pull toward both men, each representing a different part of her heart, each demanding her in ways she didn't yet understand. Finally, Edward landed a hard punch that sent Charles sprawling backward, tumbling into the muddy bank. Breathing heavily, Edward turned to Elizabeth, rain dripping from his hair, chest heaving, eyes dark with jealousy and desire. "Are you all right?" he demanded, grabbing her shoulders, keeping her close, possessive. Elizabeth nodded slowly, overwhelmed. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, heart pounding, not just from the fight, but from the undeniable truth she had felt all along. Edward's claim, his passion, his love, had shaken something deep inside her. Charles's intensity had been exciting, dangerous even, but Edward had always been the one who ignited her completely. Outside, the storm continued, lightning cracking across the mountains. Elizabeth's wet body pressed against Edward, and for the first time, she realized just how entangled her heart had become in this fight for love, passion, and desire. And from the trees, Charles watched, his eyes dark with fury and jealousy, the sound of fight echoing in his ears. He would not give up. He couldn't. Not when the woman he loved was caught between two men who had both stopped at nothing to claim her. Chapter 9. Confession and Fire. The cabin was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire. Outside, mist clung to the Montana mountains, the air crisp and cold, a reminder that winter was approaching. Elizabeth sat by the hearth, her long dark hair falling over her shoulders, eyes distant as she thought about the events of the past day. The fight at the lake, Charles's boldness, and the lingering heat of Edward's passion. Edward's boots thudded on the wooden floor as he entered, his eyes dark and intense, focused entirely on her. He stopped just inside the door, shoulders tense, jaw tight. "Elizabeth," he said, voice low and urgent, "who do you love?" Elizabeth didn't hesitate. Her heart surged as the answer became clear. "You," she said softly but firmly. "It's always been you, Edward." Relief softened Edward's harsh expression, and in a single stride he crossed the cabin and pulled her into his arms. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, the warmth of his body chasing away the lingering chill from the fire and the lake. "I'm glad," he murmured, pressing his lips to the top of her head. "I want you to stay away from Charles. He's dangerous. Elizabeth, I won't let him." Elizabeth lifted her head, looking into his eyes. I don't think he is, Edward." Edward's grip tightened, concern and frustration flickering in his gaze. "Don't underestimate him. He'll do whatever he thinks he wants, no matter the cost. Stay with me. Let me protect you." Elizabeth nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I will. I'll stay away for you." The tension between them, the relief and the fire of months of longing coiled into something urgent and undeniable. Edward leaned down, brushing his lips against hers in a slow, deliberate kiss. Elizabeth responded, hands tracing the strength of his shoulders, the familiar heat of desire rising within her. He guided her to the floor, on the rug before the fire, and this time their love was slow, deliberate, savored with every touch, every kiss, every shiver of anticipation. Edward's hands explored her gently, his lips worshipping her with a tenderness that spoke of months of restrained passion. Elizabeth's mind cleared as her body responded, every nerve alive with longing. She realized then, fully, that it had always been Edward she desired. Charles's boldness, his persistence, his kisses. They had stirred curiosity, yes, but nothing compared to this, to the way Edward claimed her, heart and soul, in every touch, in every look. They moved together in the glow of the fire, passion slow but consuming, filled with the heat of need and the certainty of love. Elizabeth moaned softly as Edward whispered her name, guiding her, caressing her, and holding her in ways that left no doubt. He was hers, and she was his. When at last they collapsed together, breathless and tangled, Elizabeth rested against Edward's chest heaving, hair damp with sweat and the heat of their intimacy. She felt an overwhelming clarity. It had always been Edward, no one else. Edward pressed his forehead to hers, his voice low and reverent. "It's always been you, Elizabeth. Always you. I love you. I love you, too," she whispered back, heart full and steady. "Only you, Edward." The fire crackled beside them, the cabin warm and safe. Outside, the mountains loomed silent and misty, unaware of the storm of desire and love that had finally settled inside the small cabin walls. But beyond the window, in the shadows, Charles watched. His hands were clenched at his sides, jaw tight with fury, eyes dark with jealousy. He had heard enough. He knew now who Elizabeth truly belonged to, and he would not surrender without a fight. Chapter 10. Kidnapped. The cabin was warm and quiet as Edward and Elizabeth lingered before the fire, the firelight dancing across their flushed faces. Their breaths mingled, their hearts still racing from the night before. "I can't believe how happy I am," Elizabeth murmured, her fingers tracing Edward's jawline. "With you, it feels like everything I ever wanted." Edward smiled, dark eyes softening. "I've waited so long for this," he said, leaning down to press a slow, lingering kiss to her lips. I can't wait to be back from town with the last of the supplies before winter. I'll be back as fast as I can. Elizabeth nodded, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. I'll be waiting, she whispered, heart full. Edward held her close a moment longer, letting his hands linger over her back. I love you, he said softly. Only you, Elizabeth. And I love you, she replied, voice steady, though a shiver of anticipation ran through her. With a final kiss, Edward swung onto his horse and rode away, leaving Elizabeth with the warmth of their love, but also a faint unease she couldn't shake. Charles had been watching from the edge of the forest, tall and willowy, eyes dark with obsession. When Edward's horse disappeared into the trail, he grinned a thin, dangerous smile. Now she's mine. He moved quickly, silently crossing the clearing. Before Elizabeth could react, he struck her with the butt of the wagon whip. Darkness swallowed her. When she came to, she was lying in the bottom of a wagon, a throbbing pain at her temple and dried blood matted in her dark hair. Charles loomed over her, eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. You're coming with me, he whispered. To my cabin. You're mine now. Elizabeth groaned, pain split in her head, but fury overtook fear. She yanked a small tray from the wagon floor and swung it at him. The clatter stunned him just long enough for her to scramble out of the wagon as it stopped near the snow-dusted forest. Her legs carried her as fast as they could over the rough, icy ground. Snow began falling, thick and wet, clinging to her hair and clothes, but she didn't stop. Back at the cabin, Edward returned hours later. He dismounted, pausing at the edge of the clearing, and froze. The door was ripped from its hinges, chairs overturned, drawers rifled through. A streak of blood led from the doorway across the floor. Elizabeth, he screamed, voice cracking with rage, his hands clenched into fists. Charles Barton, you son of a, where is she? Every instinct flared. He ran into the cabin, scanning for any sign of his wife. The place was ransacked, but empty. Edward's jaw tightened, eyes flashing. He knew who was responsible, knew Charles had a second cabin somewhere hidden in the woods, and he swore, with every beat of his heart, he would find it. He rode into town and quickly gathered the townsfolk, explaining what had happened. Men he trusted saddled up immediately, ready to search the mountains, the woods, and every cabin Charles might have hidden in. Edward's dark eyes blazed with determination. He took her, he told them. We'll find him, and God help him if she's hurt. Meanwhile, Elizabeth stumbled through the forest, snow now falling heavily, each step wet and freezing. Her head pounded, the dried blood still stinging where Charles had struck her. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay upright and moving. Her mind raced with fear and determination. I will get away. I will get back to Edward. I will survive this. Charles's cabin loomed somewhere ahead, but Elizabeth's survival instinct had taken over. Using the thickening snowfall as cover, she ducked behind trees and rocks, silently plotting her escape. Every muscle ached. Every step threatened to topple her, but she refused to stop. The storm was falling fast, and the forest was a blur of white and shadows. But Elizabeth would not give up. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 11, Rescue. The snow fell thick and fast over the Montana woods, blanketing the forest in white. Elizabeth's legs were trembling, her head throbbing from the blow Charles had dealt her, and the cold gnawed at her skin. She stumbled over roots and rocks, each step slower than the last. Her vision blurred, and the world tilted around her. Her knees gave out, and she collapsed into the snow. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. She tried to call for Edward, tried to will herself upright, but her strength failed. The last thing she remembered was the snowflakes landing on her face, cold and relentless, before unconsciousness took her. Hours later, the forest was eerily silent except for the crunch of boots in the snow. A group of townsfolk, led by a local trapper, had been searching the trails and clearings after Edward rode into town earlier, frantic and furious. One of them spotted her pale form half buried in snow. "She's alive!" one man shouted. "But barely." They worked quickly, wrapping her in blankets and lifting her onto a sled. One of the older men, a blacksmith, grunted as he steered it. "We need to get her town fast." Miles away, Edward was tracking through another wooded trail, frustrated at every turn. His horse slowed as he squinted into the distance, the snow thickening around him. Suddenly, a lone rider appeared from the tree-line, galloping hard toward him. Edward reined in his horse, recognition instant. "Jeb!" he shouted. The blacksmith slid off his horse, boots crunching in the snow. "Edward! Thank God I found you!" Jeb panted. "We've got her, Elizabeth. She's badly hurt, barely conscious. We're taking her back to town." Edward's chest tightened, fury and fear mixing in a dangerous fire. Where's the doctor? Show me the way." Jeb pointed toward the path, urgency in his eyes. "Follow me. Fast, Edward. You don't want to lose her to this snow, not tonight." Edward didn't hesitate. He pushed his horse hard, snow kicking up behind him, the miles between him and Elizabeth disappearing beneath the urgency of his ride. Finally, they reached the small town. The sled carrying Elizabeth was rushed to the infirmary. Edward close behind, heart hammering. He burst into the small building, snow clinging to his coat, eyes scanning frantically. "She's here," Jeb called, sliding the blankets back. "Barely conscious, Edward, but alive. Doc says it's going to be a rough night." Edward knelt beside her, brushing the damp hair from her face. Her dark eyes fluttered beneath closed lids, lips pale. "Elizabeth," he whispered, voice breaking. "I won't lose you. Not again. I swear it." He pressed a gentle, desperate kiss to her forehead, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath his lips. A tear slipped down his cheek as he whispered again, "I won't lose another wife. I can't. I won't." The doctor, a steady, no-nonsense man, stepped forward. "She's stable for now, Edward, but it'll be a long, rough night. I'll have my nurse stay with her." Edward nodded, eyes blazing with a calm, fierce rage. "Thank you. Document keep watch on her." He rose and turned to the townsfolk gathered in the infirmary. "Charles Barton is not going to get away with this. He's hiding somewhere, and I'll find him. Who's with me?" Several men stepped forward immediately, hands on rifles, eyes determined. Edward clenched his fists, jaw tight, snow still melting from his coat. "We move tonight. We find him. And when we do, he'll regret ever laying a hand on Elizabeth." The men nodded, tension and resolve thick in the room. Edward's gaze flicked to the small cot where Elizabeth lay unconscious but alive, and his lips tightened. The fire of vengeance and love burned in him, quiet and lethal. Chapter 12. Justice and New Beginnings. The Montana wind howled over the snowy hills as Edward and the townsfolk approached Charles's cabin. Tracks in the fresh snow told a story they had followed for hours. Edward's jaw was tight, dark eyes blazing with fury and fear for Elizabeth. "This is it," he said, voice low but hard. "Stay alert. He's dangerous." The cabin came into view, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Edward dismounted first, rifle in hand. The men followed, tense and ready. Edward crept forward, peering through the frost-covered window. Inside, Charles moved impatiently, unaware of their approach. Edward signaled the men to spread out, and in a heartbeat, the cabin door burst open. "Charles Barton." Edward's voice thundered. "Stay where you are." Charles whirled, surprise and panic flickering across his pale, tall face. "Edward, you can't." Before Charles could react further, Edward fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the mountains. Charles staggered, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his coat. He tried to flee, bolting out the back door into the snow. The townsfolk hesitated, watching as he disappeared into the blizzard, limping through the forest. Edward's eyes followed him, cold and hard. "You're done," he muttered, "and you'll never touch her again." The group returned to town, leaving Charles's fate to the wilderness. Edward's mind was on one person, Elizabeth. A week passed. Elizabeth remained unconscious, her body weak from the trauma, her head still tender from the blow. Edward never left her side. He slept in the chair beside her bed, dozing lightly, alert to every sound. He held her hand, whispered her name, and prayed for her recovery. Finally, one morning, Elizabeth's eyelids fluttered. Her dark eyes opened, confusion giving way to recognition. Edward leaned close immediately, brushing her hair back gently. "You're awake," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "God, I was so afraid." Elizabeth blinked, then smiled weakly. "Edward." He bent forward, pressing a tender kiss to her lips. I want us married right away," he whispered, voice full of love and urgency. Elizabeth laughed softly, warmth and tears in her eyes. "Then let's not waste another moment," she said, heart full. The doctor arrived a short time later to check on her. "You're doing remarkably well," he said, giving Edward a cautious smile. "And I have good news." Edward's heart leapt. "What is it?" Elizabeth's eyes widened as the doctor spoke. "She's with child." Edward felt a rush of elation and relief unlike anything he had known. He drew Elizabeth close, holding her tight. "A family," he whispered, voice choked with emotion. "Our family." Elizabeth rested her head against his chest, eyes shining. "Yes, our family." Outside, the Montana mountains stood silent and majestic, the snow falling gently. Inside the cabin, warmth, love, and hope filled the small space. The danger of the past weeks was over. The threat of Charles gone into the wilderness, and a new life, both theirs and their child's, awaited them. Edward pressed a final, lingering kiss to Elizabeth's lips, smiling into her dark, knowing eyes. "I love you, Elizabeth Laurel," he murmured, "and I always will." "And I love you," she whispered back. "Always, Edward York." The fire crackled behind them, the snowstorm passing outside, and for the first time in a long while, the cabin was filled only with peace, warmth, and a love that would endure forever. Well, that's the happy end for Elizabeth and Edward. I hope you liked the story. Sometimes I listen to a story, then stop halfway forgetting what I listened to and then have to start all over. It's okay. I do that with laundry, too. I have enjoyed writing them. Be sure to look for more evening whispers of love stories.